preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Judy Rubin, president of the 92nd Street Y, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first evening of our 6th annual series on architecture, this year entitled Art Spaces and the Shape of the City. Before introducing our guests, I would like to inform you of a change in the series. Gay Aulenti, who is to speak next week, will be unable to leave Milan. Fortunately, Michael Graves has agreed to step in and discuss with Paul Goldberger the plans for the addition to the Whitney Museum, among other issues. We decided a few moments ago that this was like Nureyev substituting for Baryshnikov and that you would not be particularly displeased. The evening will begin at 8:30 p.m. That's 8:30, rather than 8:15. We look forward to seeing you here for the evening and for the rest of the series, which remains as originally scheduled. Tonight, we will open with a short slide presentation, which will serve as a visual point of reference for the ensuing conversation between our guest, Charles Gwathmey, and series moderator, Paul Goldberger. The final segment of the evening will provide you with the opportunity to submit written questions on the index cards which you received, and which during the course of the evening will be collected by ushers who come down the aisles and bring them backstage for presentation. The cards, not the aisles. Our moderator, Paul Goldberger, is a familiar face at the 92nd Street Y, having moderated this series for 5 years. Since 1973, Mr. Goldberger has served as architecture critic of the New York Times, where he writes for the Daily Paper, the Sunday Magazine, Arts and Leisure, and book review sections. He has also contributed to Art in America, the New York Review of Books, and Architectural Record, among other publications. The author of The City Observed, New York, An Architectural Guide to Manhattan, Mr. Goldberger is the recipient of the American Institute of Architects Medal in recognition of his unique role in furthering the understanding of architecture and its impact on contemporary American culture. In 1984, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. We are delighted to welcome him back to the Y this season. Our guest this evening is Charles Gwathmey, and we are honored that he is with us again tonight. Charles Gwathmey was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, attended the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture and Yale University, where he received his Master of Architecture. Since 1964, he has been a professor of architectural design, maintaining positions at Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, and the Cooper Union School of Architecture. In 1976, Mr. Gwathmey was elected to membership in the American Institute Academy of Arts and Letters. In 1979, he was awarded the Academy's Arnold W. Brunner Prize, and in 1981, he became a fellow in the American Institute of Architects. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome to the 92nd Street Y, Charles Gwathmey and Paul Goldberger. Thank you. Good night.
The format is, I'm Charles Gwathmey, that's Paul. The format is that I show 20 slides, 10 on each side, which is supposed to not only respond to the title of the series, but to provoke Paul. I should say also that because I'm speaking for the firm of Gwathmey Siegel, and that the firm is made up of a lot of people who help us every day, and it's a collaborative effort. So the work you see, and some of the things I say are firm related, and others, depending on Paul again, might not be. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to show the slides, and I'm allowed to briefly speak. The existing annex of the Guggenheim Museum on your left and the proposed section of the new proposed addition on the right, showing a transformation not only of the inside but of the outside. And the reason for showing this section is simply to show a new integration of the existing Frank Lloyd Wright building, the annex, and the proposed six-story addition above it, primarily to incorporate new permanent exhibition space, as most of you know. The only thing that's interesting to note is that the entire Frank Lloyd Wright building will be open for the first time to the public in this new scheme, and there will be on the fifth floor a major sculpture roof terrace, which will reveal a whole new aspect of the dynamics of the original building and have a roof connection as well to the small rotunda. So the idea of the scheme was to not only make this addition, but to make it integrated totally into the interior fabric of the original building. Scheme on the left was the first scheme we did, still referred to by certain people at the New York Post as the toilet bowl scheme. The scheme on the right is the addition as approved by the Board of Standards and Appeals last week. And I think it's clear there was a very different strategy between the former and the latter schemes. I'm not making a value judgment about it, but there is a different strategy in response to, I think, fair criticism and some unfair criticism. And the facade facing Fifth Avenue and an aerial photograph of the model, indicative, I think, that the new addition, in a sense, reframes the site, relates it to the existing Fifth Avenue buildings, and sort of makes a place for the original Frank Lloyd Wright building, in a sense, almost putting it euphemistically back in the park where he originally wanted it to be. This was a transformation in Queens, a series of renovations of existing warehouse buildings as found on the left, and its first renovation on the right, into IDC New York, the International Design Center, which are showroom buildings, as I said, warehouse buildings converted into major exhibition buildings for the entire furniture, home furnishings, commercial furniture industries, and again, the transformation of the courtyards of those buildings into spaces like this, which recall the old sort of great public spaces, skylit spaces that are major rooms, referential rooms, off of which the circulation and, in this case, the showrooms occur. This is a tower that's in the site that Paul raved about in the New York Times this past Sunday because it was empty. I thought I'd show the building that's going to go in there, and I show it two ways. One, in a white, unadorned model, which is interesting to us because as the first skyscraper, so-called, that we've done, we were very interested in the sort of the classic model and reinterpreting as a modern building the ethic of the urban skyscraper. And the whole analysis and demonstration in the white model was to talk about the base, a base which is articulated and modulated and resolves itself with that sort of segmented curved bay window, almost presenting itself, if you will, as a kind of public building at the bottom, perceived very differently as a pedestrian on the one hand. Then the tower, which was consciously foreshortened, and the top beginning about 60% up. So the top is not just the top at the sort of cut pyramid, but it begins at the erosions and the reentry corners on the way up. The elaboration then in the model photograph on the right was to reinforce the corners, which in the tradition of building is to reinterpret materiality, to bring the building down to the ground, integrate it through the base, and to talk about a building which was not only legitimate in silhouette from a distance and had a graphic from a distance, but also had a very real urban response and urban perception from the ground. This is the site right above the AWA sign. And I love this slide because it shows that black building, which actually looks like a Claes Oldenburg mockery of a skyscraper. This is probably the worst of modernism, and our building in the model is trying to demonstrate a sort of different vision, if you will. And then finally, a historical piece. We were asked to do a traditional house, and we said we couldn't, but we could renovate a Dutch barn. And this is an original old Dutch barn frame, which has been transformed into a house which you see on the right. And I just show this as the notion of art spaces, is this is another intervention, if you will, not urban, but rural, into an existing context, an existing physical frame, and the idea of its elaboration sort of summarizes, I hope, what we may talk about tonight. Those are the slides. Okay? Michael Gray's behind the screen.
Charles, let me add a word of welcome before we get into the substance to all of you. This is, in fact, the 6th series, as you were told. Maybe after 6 years we will finally figure out a smooth way to handle slides, but I think we're doing okay. Next year we begin dancing out from behind the screen, but not this year. I'm eager to talk about everything you showed us, but I think it would be somewhat disingenuous to talk about the gemütlich Gwathmey of the barn before we get into the building that has been on everybody's mind for a long time, even before this evening was planned, and continues to be one that, at least as I travel around the country, I'm asked about much more than many larger projects, which is the Guggenheim. And I think it's particularly fortuitous that Michael Graves will be here next week to talk about the building to which this project is so often compared, the proposed additions to the Whitney. You were, I guess, wonderfully mellow, maybe is the word, to be able to use that New York Post phrase. I too got actually a great deal of mail after the first project was announced, making that same analogy. Let's talk about the two versus each other. You alluded to a very dramatic change from one to the other. There certainly was, in my view, since I did not, as you might perhaps remember, support the first one, but did support the second one. Can you tell us something about the change in philosophy? How much of it was yours? How much of it was the museum's? What led to it? And so forth. and perhaps describe in a little more detail the shift from the first scheme that the audience saw on the left to the one that's now proposed that was on the right.
I'll try. I too have been asked a lot of questions about the revised design versus the former design, and students are very interesting. They like to know which one we like better. And that's a very hard question for me, despite the criticism of the former scheme. I think they're two very different strategies. The former scheme was to make a definite counterpoint to establish a third object in a trilogy, if you will, between the large and the small rotunda. It was clearly an idea of juxtaposition of style, if there's such a thing, style in a deeper meaning, in a sense, from history, a de Steele sort of reference. And it was, I think, more aggressive, also in a positive sense, and upset a lot of people. And the criticism, and interestingly enough, Michael Graves was a very informative critic to me, at least, about that first scheme, and that he thought, and this is going to be interesting next week, that he thought that the new scheme was too overpowering and could not fairly compete with the strength of Frank Lloyd Wright's original, and felt that the most appropriate response would be to reinterpret the wall which many of you know was implied, at least, by the original Frank Lloyd Wright annex, which was about the same size as our addition on the same site. And I thought that was interesting that one architect who wrapped the Whitney could tell me to be discreet and make a wall. So you don't see what you do, but you see what other people's do, well, and you're a very good critic.
Maybe yes, maybe no. On the other hand, isn't it true that the Whitney is not the Guggenheim, or the Guggenheim is not the Whitney? I mean, I think you had either the opportunity or the dilemma of being confronted with the problem of adding to what is unquestionably one of the great works of architecture of the 20th century. I think the Whitney is merely a good but also problematic and difficult modern building. The Guggenheim is one of the great icons of our time. They're really not in the same category.
No, I agree. But anyway, Graves was a very informative critic. So the second scheme, just briefly, was clearly a reinterpretation, not to have a tripartite composition, but to really make a referential wall, right, off of which the original object would assert itself in a way, and that the orthogonal gridding of the wall recalled Wright's facade, and it also made a subtler counterpoint to the dynamics of the curves of the original building. Also, by changing its materiality and making it more neutral, making it limestone, in a sense putting it in a sort of literal context to Fifth Avenue buildings and New York buildings in general, and making it recessive, if you will, all were responses not only to a change in program, which was a reduction in program, but to the criticism that the first scheme engendered. The problem I've always had, though, is that the critics of the first scheme then switched gears and started to relate the new scheme not in any way as an imposition or a desecration in the same way that they talked about the first scheme, but instead they tried to relate it back to Frank Lloyd Wright's building, and when it was convenient, talked about his annex as only being a sketch, when they wanted to deny its legitimacy, and then criticized our facade as not being his facade when they wanted to accept it. So I felt, as a teacher and as someone interested in the history of architecture, that you can't have it both ways. If we can turn around and come back with a totally new proposition that is clearly, we think, answering the issues and responding to the issues, then the same rules should hold. However, emotions being what they are, and a kind of automatic sort of response being what it is, this thing has carried on till, at least for the moment, last week, when it was approved.
Right. Just to digress from the larger issues for a moment, the approval it received last week at the Board of Standards and Appeals is the final official city approval necessary. Is that right?
That's right.
So it would only be what one would call an extraordinary act, such as a lawsuit, that would hold it up at this stage. Is that fair to say?
It would be a fairly complex set of circumstances which would overturn the Board of Standards and Appeals. We've heard, given the resolution, when the resolution was very positive about our scheme and did not offer or accept any of the alternative proposals in any form with the new scheme.
There were alternative proposals made? There
were alternative proposals made by an architect who was retained by the Carnegie Hill neighbors named Michael Courtland.
Right. Is that the underground proposal?
That's the underground proposal.
Right, right. You've always found that unfeasible financially, functionally, both? What?
Well, it's clearly more expensive. When we first did our analysis of the Guggenheim, going underground was a very seductive way of increasing all the back of the house space, which was essential to the workings of the museum. And so our study of the underground proposal was not to make exhibition space and not to disrelate the sort of programmatic priorities, but to have that as a future alternative if the museum had to grow again. The proposed underground scheme was this is not subjective, but in the eyes of engineers and in the eyes of the museum particularly, not responsive either to their program or to the proposed cost. So I'm stepping back from criticizing it. I'll just take it.
Say that, okay. It's fair to say, isn't it, that if we can sort of simplify the goal of your first scheme and your second scheme, that the first one sort of met Wright's strength with, you kind of tried to get down there with Wright and meet strength with strength. The other sort of stepped back and met strength with neutrality, in effect. Is that fair or is that not fair? You can tell me.
You want it to be
it.
fair? What does gemütlich mean, anyway?
Gemütlich? Yeah. Means kind of, homey and easy and relaxed and all that.
Right. Romantic and stuff?
Not too romantic. No, let's not get carried away now. I mean, come on. I'm saving romantic for a question about another building. So
okay. I think
keep that in reserve.
I think I think what happens when you reevaluate, when you redesign, you have to reevaluate. You have to step all the way back. You really don't try to sort of adjust an original proposition that is.
Well, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at. I mean, from A to B, you really started again.
You have to start again. And when you start again, you have the benefit of going through an already fairly comprehensive investigation, and you see it in a different way. I mean, you force yourself to see it in a different way. So I think the new scheme is clearly more supportive of the interior, the entire interior condition of the original building. It enriches that whole sequence, and it's going to add more permanent exhibition space than the original scheme. And I think in the end, if you take the conservative point of view, which I hate to do, it will be looked on as being more responsive to the existing condition.
Responsive or respectful?
Both.
Both. Okay. Because I think, in fact, I'm going to give you one here. I'm going to say that you could actually argue that the second is more respectful, the first is more responsive in the sense of engaging in a kind of, game of tennis with Wright and actually taking him on and having an active dialogue as opposed to a somewhat more passive dialogue that the present scheme does.
I think that's very good. Why didn't you write it that way instead of saving it
Because
for 4 years later? If you'd written it that way, we wouldn't have had the problem.
Well, no, if I'd written it that way, you might have gotten the first scheme through, and that would not have been as good, actually. I think. I'm not saying that I think it was right. I'm merely saying that this is a rationale that you could have used. That's all. Let me ask you, in fact, do you think there are buildings that it is right to consider, R-I-G-H-T, to consider sacred cows or sacred, that should not be tampered with, altered with, should be left alone? Obviously, if you do, this is not one of them, or you wouldn't have taken the job.
No, but I think that's a terrible question in a sense, because it denies both intellectually the history of architecture, and it denies, in fact, the history of architecture. That there are major institutional classic buildings that we all recognize that have been added to, and I think any architect who regards both history and the notion of dialogue and extension and the sort of the state of the art as being ongoing would not accept that view. I also don't think really that the addition to the Guggenheim is in any way as intrusive or as sort of imposing in reality as people perceive it. I think it's more the idea and more what the first scheme generated than in the reality. And I think we're going to refine it, and that it's going to be a major enrichment, not only by sort of setting it in its place, but the whole expansion of the interior and the comparison between what I would call traditional gallery, more static space, as opposed to the dynamic space, is going to be a very rich and very wonderful counterpoint to the sort of one-liner and the relentlessness that it is now. And again, I think the critic should look at the total picture. Is that the Guggenheim would not be if it were not for that interior space. It is the icon of that space, and Frank Lloyd Wright was involved in that space, the spiral notion, for years. And so the resultant figuration of that building is a result and a manifestation of the interior volume. And to expand that and to elaborate on that, yet still being totally respectful of its, in a sense, purity, with this addition, I personally think is very exemplary. So I compliment ourselves on that.
Good. I'm glad that you're firmly behind this. I don't think the interior was ever really the question, though. I mean, except for a few rather extreme critics. I think most sane, rational, intelligent critics working for major newspapers were not taking issue with the interior at all, which in fact was always
the Wall Street Journal, the Post, the House and Garden, sane, rational, right. No,
we're taking issue with the exterior relationships and not. I mean, there may have been some, but in general, I don't think the assertion that the addition would improve the quality of the interior gallery space was challenged.
I think it has to be taken as a whole.
Right.
I think a program is a program, a building is a building, and the integration of those things are inspectable and should be overviewed.
Let me ask you this. Since you have chosen not to take a position that is more in favor of what now appears to be the final scheme versus the earlier scheme, why, can you tell us why both you and the museum chose to make a fairly radical alteration in your plans to go to the second scheme rather than try to fight for the first scheme?
I didn't say I didn't say that. I said that if I had my instincts and my intuition, and being the kind of architects we are,
Right.
is that I think in the long run, the first scheme could have been either fantastic or a disaster. It was
Okay.
not a safe scheme.
Right.
I enjoy that idea of not being safe. I think the second scheme is going to be acceptable on all levels, and is going to rely really on its sort of finite resolution. Is it in the sense of the detail and in the sensitivity of its intersections and all of the things that one is going to inspect? It's going to come down to that. The first scheme was either going to be a hit or a miss,
Right.
and the dynamics of it are still very appealing to me. I think from the museum's point of view and from the actual gallery space point of view and what they're going to show, the second scheme is an improvement.
Right. Okay, I'll buy that. But I think in turn, haven't you also granted one of the major concerns of the critics, which is that one of the great Frank Lloyd Wright buildings of all time is a hell of a thing to take a chance with?
Yeah, well,
You know, I mean, we're not...
you only live once. I mean, when I was going to high school and I met Frank Lloyd Wright and he was standing on that site,
He said,
you had any idea?
He said, young man in another... Right.
Right, 30 some odd years later that we would be proposing an addition to that building is a staggering thing to begin with.
True.
So I'm very humbled by that. But then now that it's here and we got the shot,
Right.
take the shot, right? I mean, this is tough. This is, you know, you sort of have to evaluate what it means in the long run.
Right.
And right now, I regard all the activity, even though it's been 6 years, as being short run, because when, as you know, Wright built that building and proposed it in 1952.
47, that's right.
Yeah,
It goes
but
even
when
earlier.
it got to be,
Right.
it caused an outrage.
Right.
Now it's a masterpiece and an icon, right? So you sort of, hopefully young enough, 20 years will come around again and they'll be nice to us. The euphemistic they.
In other words, who is it going to be who's going to propose an addition to the Gwathmey Siegel addition that's going to be violently
That'd be pretty
protested?
wild, actually.
Okay. I'm sure we will come back to the Guggenheim with some of your questions, so I want to move on for a moment, but also remind all of you that to jot down questions, civilized and otherwise, on this and other subjects, and pass them to Y staff members who will collect them. Let's jump to Times Square for a minute, since you touched on my favorite hole at 47th
That was nice
and
of you
Broadway.
to show our hole.
I thought you'd be very pleased
I
to have
was.
your hole shown. I mean, it's a
I
much
did.
handsomer one than most of the others, after all. I mean, it's got a great little construction fence with
Very, very
cute graphics on
right.
it.
Very soft, very pretty.
Who did the graphics on the construction fence?
Um,
Kind of nice.
I'll think of it in a minute. Starts with a D.
Okay. That struck me as a building that really sort of epitomizes what an attitude that we call kind of romantic modernism. I mean, it is romantic in the sense of evoking setback tower forms of another period, It's modern, obviously, in the very sleek quality of the materials and the way in which glass is used and so forth. I mean, was that your goal, really, to try to meld two different attitudes?
Well, now if the Guggenheim is historically referenced and has a sort of respectfulness that you referred to before,
Right.
To Wright, which is now part of history. I think when you do a building type that has all the pressure of the urban condition that a New York City vertical building must address, the fault with, and it being a little automatic, the fault with vertical buildings of a different era before this, in a way, was that they disregarded all those pressures. They also disregarded history. It was expedient, and it was visually sort of unresolved.
Right.
They tended to be not only divorced from their place and not being able to reestablish a sense of place, but they were also divorced from the skyline,
Right.
and the fabric in which they exist. So I think, as any architect who keeps going, history is important to refer to, not to copy, not to emulate necessarily, but the principles of what early skyscrapers did and their responses was important to us. And all the issues of perception from a distance, perception closer, and then perception as a pedestrian on the street, were all very serious propositions that, if you regarded, you could enrich the building. So that was all, I think, a very important part of the investigation, and in a sense, since we'd never done one before, it was totally fresh. So we had no preconception. We had no sort of history of that. So that the idea of looking fresh at a building type which we all knew, rather than having to build one, but subliminally knew, and as architects knew about, it was very interesting to sort of pull out the priorities and to be able to speak to that, articulate that through the manifestation of a building design. And I think from that point of view, it's going to be very strong, not only in allowing you to still see the Edison Hotel,
Great.
but it is, in the purest sense, an object that is perceived as an object in a lower fabric, and what's very important is what that lower fabric is. So the base of that building, conceived of as to have a presence of a public building, and perceived that way as a pedestrian, is very important.
Right.
So it's in that whole manipulation of freeing the tower, of literally making it an object in space, and having air around it, yet reestablishing the street and all the conditions that should be supported by the urban fabric was important.
Now, some of that's the zoning, though, isn't it? I mean, weren't you required to do some of that?
Yeah, but you can interpret zoning. I mean,
Sure.
Zoning and FARs, which is the floor area ratio, and where that building is and what you get in bonuses and all that kind of stuff. Again, learning that fresh and not being automatic about it drove us to be more responsive to the urban condition, to the type, to the prototype, as opposed to the sort of peculiarities of it. So that, in a sense, it's more idealized on the one hand, and very specific because of Broadway and all of the zoning conditions on the other, and the specificity makes it responsive, is, I think, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it is very responsive to the specifics of that context. It is not a sort of platonic object dropped as from outer space, the way the Uris building you pointed out, the Black building, is. It's not platonic in the sense of being ideal, but in the sense of its disconnection from what's around it. Sure. And I sense an enormous development from your building at Columbia, the dorm at Columbia, which I guess was your first high-rise building, to this, just in terms of willingness to deal in particulars rather than generalities.
I think the building at Columbia was a truly transitional, very tough problem for us. As it was our first, not only tall building, but our first major urban large-scale project that was driven very specifically by site constraints and program constraints, which were very tough.
Right.
Where we missed, I think fairly, is that even though the office building is a tight skin,
Right.
it has a kind of sensuousness and a modulation because of the varying materials and the materiality of it that give it a sense of depth
Right.
and a sense of illusion. Columbia turned out, unfortunately, we thought, which would be very graphic, became very flat.
Right.
And
It
you
is very
didn't get
flat.
the sense of the depth of field. You didn't get the sense when you came up to it that the details really became available.
Any different from when you were
Right.
far away. Yeah, right.
So from that point of view, it missed. But you have to do it to then,
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, learn why it did. And I think it was a very good lesson from that point of view.
Well, there were things you were kind of heading toward at Columbia that I felt were actually not particularly subtle, where there's a lot of subtlety in this building. I mean, the use of red at the bottom to tie in with the brick context on Morningside and the white above, or the gray above, seemed to be a kind of almost simplistic way of doing something that you then learn can be done in much more subtle ways later on.
I agree with that. How come we're talking about Columbia?
Well, why not?
Oh, okay.
Okay, we can talk about anything.
That's okay. No, okay, that's it.
Well, we're talking about Columbia
No,
because,
no,
in
I'm
fact, I
teasing
think
you.
it shows what. I mean, I guess the real problem I always had with the dorm at Columbia was that it looked a lot like a lot of your early houses
blown up.
blown up in size, but not
Right.
really changed in
I agree.
scale.
I agree with that.
And here, suddenly, you're doing other building types from scratch rather than just making bigger houses.
I agree with that.
Yep.
And that transition is harder than you think, or harder than we thought it was going to be.
And you guys obviously got to it by fighting through yourself, not simply looking at what somebody else was doing who was already there and knocking it off, but earning your way toward it.
Well, we
in a way.
tend to be, unfortunately, over pragmatic
Right.
and believe in the sort of the lessons that we learn rather intuitively, and so we suffer these consequences.
Right. Okay. Let's go across the river for a minute and talk about IDC.
Okay.
That was a different kind of project for you, wasn't it? In that it was reuse of older buildings, of which you've done some, but your practice hasn't really focused on it. And it was also very concerned with what we might call placemaking. I mean, the creation of a sense of place in a place that either had no sense of place or had the wrong sense of place given the new program of sort of shishi furniture showrooms that was coming in there. What was your first thought when you came out there and saw those old factory buildings?
Well, when this was a real vision for Lazard Realty, a guy named Harvey Schulweiss, who's president of that, saw these buildings there and realized that you couldn't reconstitute that amount of space and that scale and that sort of weight of building mass.
Right.
And to be able to have the vision to convert these buildings into really exhibition buildings and to create a mart, in a sense, that was unique compared to other marts in the country. I mean, all of you have been to the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. It's terribly disorienting. You don't know where you are. You never see the outdoors.
It's like a 10-story subway
You have
station.
absolutely
is sort of
no
what it
idea.
feels like, actually.
it's a relentless place. And when we first saw these buildings, we thought they were kidding, that it was just too unbelievable an opportunity. And for a long time, we went along with the joke. We were designing a way.
As long as they were paying their bills, you could go along with the joke.
Well, I didn't say that. I said we went along with the whole joke, and we were on the come, just like they were in a way. And the more we got involved with the buildings, the more sort of fantastic they became, and realizing that the partie of those buildings, a courtyard building, as being such a classic beginning and such an opportunity, very simply, if you just recognize the partie and then exploit all of the advantages that it provides, that in the end you could make a place which was neutral on the one hand, but very powerful as an organizing idea on the other. So that was really the thing, was to exploit all of the positive existing conditions, and to, in a sense, weave a new presence and a new sense of space and a new sense of place into that complex. And I think when it's all done and we take that parking lot out and put the park there in that scale of things, that it will be a sort of a phenomenal environment to go from all three of those buildings across the bridges and experience each one of those major rooms, aside from all the design in the showrooms, So it's a rich place, and it was terrific to be involved in that kind of thing.
It's brought out a kind of almost whimsy in your work that we don't always see. I mean, the bridge, for example, that was just completed between Center 1 and Center 2 across the street is,
I love the bridge.
Really wonderful. Yeah.
I credit Frank Gehry a little bit with the bridge. I always give credit where it's due. And the sort of automatic bridge would have been simply to build a rectangle across the street. The idea of making a wedge, which became much more...
You should actually describe the bridge, because I don't think it was photographed.
No, I didn't have it on the slide. The buildings were different levels to each other, and we had to connect three floors, so all the diagonals that went across the street were not parallel, as well as the roof and the bottom of the bridge potentially not being parallel. So we exploited that idea, and the bridge is an asymmetrical parallelogram, which looks like it just sort of landed in between the buildings and locks itself in, and becomes, in a sense, a terrific sort of object counterpoint to the facade, the relentless sort of facade of the two buildings, and it becomes a place of expectation. You remember it, you're happy when you get to it, and it's an experience going through it, because it really reparticipates back to the streetscape. And it's another idea about the whole center that says that you should always be aware somehow of where you are in the scheme of things. Of 2 million square feet, you should know where you are some of the time, right? And so that was very interesting, and it really is an urban bridge, in that it's the scale of the street on the one hand, and it sort of focuses the street, which is the urban thing, by the oculus, and then the dynamics of the ramps sliding through it make a whole different sort of inspection. So when I say responded to the Frank Gehry idea, the idea that Frank would make this incredible object between these buildings, it sort of refers to that.
Do you have any interest in doing a rehab job on the Hunter College bridges on Lexington Avenue, actually?
Oh, I don't want to speak about...
okay.
I mean, you did already.
That's true, I have already. But there's always chances to do it again. What about the major spaces, which are really rather powerful, and they've become used, in fact, as art exhibition spaces, as meeting spaces, as celebration spaces, and so forth. Do you think we have the ability to create major, monumental, public and cultural space in our time, or are we going to be forced to try to, in effect, salvage it or rescue it, as you have done, by carving it out of monumental older buildings that have been left to us the way these old factory buildings have?
Well, I think that's a real problem, and I think it's a fair question. That the reason I showed IDC and the Guggenheim as a sort of parallel is that they are both urban, they're both found, and they both intrinsically have major rooms in them. And I think the Guggenheim is one of the last major interior rooms in modern architecture, and that they're very hard because of all the other things that drive architecture today to recreate. So when you can take buildings like that, which are literally falling down but have a very real structure, and you can very simply reconstitute a major space, which is what you're talking about in the scale of the old post offices, the old train stations,
exactly, sure,
the old libraries. I think that's essential and is preservation in the best sense of the word. It's not automatic. It's not preservation for the sake of. It's not old is good and new is bad. It's taking all of the potential richness of an existing condition, elaborating on it, and making something new that participates, that recalls, but doesn't recall literally. Recalls in terms of ideal, and establishes a whole new lifespan for something that could not be again. Right. So,
actually, one other thing I like very much about the IDC is the balance between the presence of the older buildings and the presence of something new. I mean, the facades on most sides, in fact, are really just cleaned up, painted versions of the original. They're not resheathed. There's not some new glass skin over it. You feel the factoryness of those old buildings, even though they are considerably cleaned up and redressed. And I like that. That
was intentional, and then the sort of simplicity of the interior facades reconstituted was also purposeful. So you could have that sort of abstractness and kind of clarity, not getting mixed up with sort of automatically saving the inside facades as the same as the outside facades. That there is a transformation between the two, and there's a memory of one to the other. And so I think the whole IDC experience, not just in terms of being an architect, but just what it gives back to the public at large architecturally, is the best example, a type of best example of preservation that there is.
Good. You have inspired a number of interesting questions, so I want to turn to what all of you have to say.
He edits these, you know.
Oh, I actually make them all up, but you're going to be pleased to know that I think we'll begin by going about 6,000 miles away. Someone asks, like the Guggenheim, there's an icon in Spain that is currently being added onto. What do you think of the idea of modern architects finishing Gaudi's Sagrada Familia? Another questioner, actually two questioners on Sagrada Familia. Another one asks the same thing and says, here's a case of another idiosyncratic modern master who also deliberately left a master plan for a building he knew could not be finished in his lifetime. Is finishing it also a sacrilege?
Well, no, I don't think...
Now, we know you have not yet gotten the job to finish Sagrada Familia, so you have to...
I was going to say thank God, because it'd be hard to measure. You know? I mean, a lot of people in the office would like to go to Spain, but I don't think they'd like to measure it. But no, I don't. If you're going to do that, I don't think you should finish it in any way assuming that you would be Gaudi. I think what you should do is to be, or try to be, inspired by, through learning about the process, and that's a perfect example of potential dialogue. Is it the sort of juxtaposition potential there, the idea of a dialogue again between what is and then what was and then what could be, would be very interesting. I think it would be impossible to emulate somebody like Gaudi and somebody like Wright. I don't think we should.
Right.
In other words, we're all here, in a sense, to find out why we do it, and to be responsive and respectful, and to understand the roots. I think that's critical when you're talking about existing buildings, and when you're talking about history. You have to understand the principles of why something is, not just the style of what something is. So it's in that interpretation or reinterpretation, and in the transformation from the style to the interpretation, that's very interesting. So I think if they're going to finish that building, that's a great problem. I think the guy to do it is up at Harvard, probably, who did the Roman Museum. Yeah,
Raphael Moneo.
Raphael Moneo.
But what about the question of simply leaving it as a ruin? Do you find that is that cowardly or is that wise?
I don't think it's either, and I don't think we always have the choice. I would like to say that if it comes about that there is an opportunity to comment on an existing masterpiece or on an existing condition, my sort of projection, being positive, would be it would be an enrichment rather than a debasement. St. Peter's was added to how many times? 6, by all kinds of guys like Michelangelo.
Among the Michelangelo, right?
Yeah, a few of those guys.
Okay.
And nobody said anything.
How do you know? How do you know that nobody said anything? How do you know that the?
Because he lived to be 87 years old or 89, something.
So
like
will
that.
you? But I mean,
no.
How do you know that the community board of the Janiculum didn't sort of rise up and say?
Well, I know because it took so long to build in those days, and he got it built very quickly. That the Pope liked it, and that was it.
Well, that's
I
that
wish
I
we
think
had
is
a
the
Pope.
difference. That is the difference. No, I think.
Who's the Pope of the Guggenheim?
Well, we discovered at Columbus Circle that the mayor thought he was the Pope there, but it doesn't seem to be quite working that way. Let me give you a couple of other interesting Guggenheim questions. The Guggenheim, with the addition, looks like a wimpy bas-relief sculpture instead of a bold, freestanding, sweeping form. I know tampering with a building is different from, say, adding a little red square to a perfectly balanced Mondrian, because a building has to function in a way a painting does not. A building is part of an ever-changing cityscape and all that, but still it is a masterpiece and should be left as is. So I disagree with you. My question is, why can't the Guggenheim buy space off-site elsewhere on the Upper East Side? The Guggenheim is, after all, an art museum, not a sheet metal company that needs more space. So why can't they respect their most prized possession, the building itself?
Please don't clap for that. This is a trite and very old argument that we've heard many times, and I think it's too bad that you have to think that way. And that wasn't a question. That was another night. That was another evening here. But that's okay. I will answer it. No, I don't. I think that the integrity and the essence of the original building is retained even more so for 2 reasons. One is that the proposed addition regards the original architect's annex proposal as precedent. So there's a history that is documented and that was almost fulfilled by Taliesin West, who I think misinterpreted that piece. So it's not that the original architect felt or thought of his building as a sacred object, but he too had serious questions about its interlock or its mediation into the urbanscape that it's in. So I don't think we've invented, in a sense, this annex. I think to talk about the Guggenheim as buying space elsewhere is so demeaning of a major institution. You wouldn't say that about the Metropolitan Museum. You haven't said it about the Modern Art Museum. An institution has a right, if it's vibrant, to grow and to expand. Sometimes it's harder than others, but intellectually and culturally, to deny the Guggenheim to be able to show its work is, forget architecture and forget us, is a denial of an enrichment of our time and our place. So I disagree with you. Thank you. You can clap now.
Related to it is a question from somebody who was impressed with, or was interested in at least, in Charles Boxenbaum's proposal in Architectural Record, the Guggenheim being left alone and made into an architectural museum, and a completely new museum, perhaps designed by Gwathmey Siegel, put on another site. Do you want to comment on that proposal at all?
I don't think that's what the history of architecture is about. As if you believe that it's fluid, and you don't believe that it's static, and you believe that the Guggenheim Museum is an experience architecturally as well as an experience visually for what it shows, that there's an overlap there. To make it not a museum would be, at least from my point of view, denying its reason for being, and would eliminate another enrichment and another layer of perception that museums are about. So I think that's putting it in the tombstone in the category and making it really a very static monument. I don't think people just come, as some people have said, to see the building. I think people come and want to come to see the building and the art in it. And I think that's why museums are such a vital architectural problem, is that it is this merger and it is this confrontation of sculpture, fine art, with architecture that makes it so rich. So I disagree with Charles Boxenbaum, who I know very well, and was actually shocked by that, by him saying that.
Having 6 years of experience with public and press turmoil over the Guggenheim, would you have any advice for Moshe Safdie and Morton Zuckerman? How about don't talk to the press?
Oh God, I think that project of many pieces that I've read and agreed with you on, that one I agreed with you 100%. I thought you were very clear about what drove it. I thought you were clear about the anomalies and the contradictions, and I think that sort of condition is up for reevaluation. And given what's happened this past week, more than anything else, it may cause that. Otherwise, I don't really want to talk about Mort Zuckerman and Safdie. No.
Okay. Thank you. I think you're right that there has to be some benefit in a 500-point drop in the stock market. And
no, but I do think it's strange that people would stand across the street under umbrellas and talk about the shadows. I don't know whether that's pantomime or that's another joke, but it's pretty wild when you think of that. New York is a city that inherently is about finding light. You go find it. That's why a lot of people go to Central Park when it's sunny out. They don't go on the north side of a cross street.
Right, except the question is, yes, it's about finding light, except you want to at least have an even chance at it, I would think. I mean, you don't want the deck stacked so completely against you that it's impossible.
No, but I mean, the ethic and the morality of New York has always been, despite what you're now saying, about vertical buildings, and I think it's how they're done and how responsive they are that is really in the end the measure. Manhattan is a very small island and very rich in land values of what they are, and that's always been. So I think it's how it's done and the sensitivities involved that we should be really talking about. The idea of never building another tall building in New York is, I don't think, realistic. and I think it's difficult. I found your article Sunday difficult from that point of view, that you were raving about the holes in Times Square and worried about what was coming. I had to do this because you can't be one way the whole thing, right?
Okay.
So I thought you were playing both ends. I thought you were hoping for good architecture since it was going to be anyway.
Right.
But
On at least one site. Right?
yeah, and you were playing that thing about isn't it amazing what you can see when there's no buildings there?
Well, but
You know, that's like the guys across the street with the umbrellas keeping off the shadow. I mean, I don't know. I find it problematic. What I think you were saying and hoping you were saying was that you want all these buildings to be more responsive and more urbanistic than the ones that have been built before.
I was saying that, thank you. I was also saying that I wished that they could be a little bit smaller. And I was also saying, look, this is an extraordinary moment in the urban condition with all of these sites simultaneously cleared, and that even if this moment will not be permanent, and indeed perhaps should not be permanent, but nonetheless it's an extraordinary thing you must see so as to remember. Just as, for example, that period a couple of years ago when the site to the north of the Chrysler Building was empty, or when the excavation existed for IBM and AT&T, and suddenly that whole section was transformed very dramatically and in a temporary way. I think if one is both in love with the city and in love with the rhythm and change of the city, that's a moment that one does not want to miss.
I agree with
that. And that was all I was trying to say there. Not that it should remain as this sort of, hole in the ground national park and be kept that way.
Well, I'm glad you re-explained it to us.
Okay. I mean, on the other hand, that does not mean that I think it's wonderful that every one of those sites is being filled with a building too big for itself. Let me give you an easy one.
Okay.
Is your job fun? If so, what aspects bring you the most joy? And is it difficult divorcing yourself from a project when it's complete?
I think architecture and art is a confrontational game that one that really stresses you, and the fun of it is really to, on your own terms, both grow and solve the problem at the moment, and to hope that you've learned from what you've done and that you're going to provoke a sort of new understanding or a new perception by what you've just done. It is very hard to spend 3 years or more in seeing something finally come to be, and that's a very frustrating time because, unfortunately, when you conceive of a building and you design it, you don't realize it in terms of it being built for a long time after, and there's a lot that happens in that time between that you would rethink it. So you have to sort of isolate the moment of decision, that is the design decision, and to say this was a good moment and I've learned by it, and then you have to look at the building when it's built and during the process of its built as a separate, in a way, learning experience where you can reapply, where you may be able to, if you have a supportive client, reevaluate, make changes, but it all is part of the growing. So the sort of sense of instability is both important to understand. It's not always enjoyable, but it makes you constantly active in the pursuit. So if you like being unstable and not knowing what it's going to be like in 3 years, I think it's terrific fun, and I like that.
Okay. In moving from designing private residences to designing public and corporate funded structures, aside from the remuneration and recognition involved, do you find the requirements of architecture becoming less creative individual expression and more compromise and capitulation? That is, are the new challenges more political than architectural?
Well, I don't know. We don't get to do very many corporate buildings, and we still love to do houses. So the whole idea of using the house, in a sense, as a microcosm, a study of architectural problems has always been an integrated sort of pursuit in our practice. Sometimes we make a better translation than others from the house to the large building, but it's important, I think, to have a balanced practice and a varied practice where that each opportunity is unique, and that the sort of chance for repetition is reduced, and that you can look each time with a fresh eye, and always have small scale, very intensive things to do that you realize when you solve the small scale problem and you resolve the very specific sort of demands of that, then it allows you then to sort of retranslate it on a larger scale. And you really do keep the same ethic. You really try to, at least in a sense, guide every architectural problem into a morality position, into an ideal position, into an idea position, and not simply just a problem-solving expedient situation. So what I think you have to do first is believe, obviously, in what you do, and to be passionate about it, and to also believe that it's an intellectual process, and that in theory you can expand a client's sort of preconceptions as much as you can expand your own, and that the sort of the dialogue that occurs there, no matter what the building type, is extremely important. So we sort of go into each sort of condition in a very idealized level, and we try very hard to maintain it. And I think a very fair example would be that office building on Times Square, right, which could have been driven by strict economics and tough sort of constraints, both zoning and economic, and the whole elaboration and understanding the economy of means and how then you elaborate on that is really part of the problem. So I think, just to not sound long-winded, you have to understand the constraints of the problem and enrich the problem within those limits, always with the ideal of making art. So from that point of view.
Well, but for you, I mean, you spoke of morality a little while ago. For your firm, your morality really has been what we might call the morality of the well-tempered object, of the well-conceived object. Is that right, or is there another kind of morality for you?
There are a lot of other kinds of moralities. The well-tempered object is very well said, I guess. I'm trying to think what you mean because I'm nervous now. This is the first time I've gotten nervous.
Don't get nervous.
No, I think the morality is that you explore, and that in the end you can stand next to what you've explored and made and believe in the morality of the process,
right, and
that there is a purity about that which nobody can take away from you, win or lose. You have the process.
I'll give you another easy one. What kind of a house do you live in? Actually, the questioner has a postscript to that. Are you at heart modern, postmodern, or what?
At heart?
At heart.
At heart, I'm a modernist. I live in an apartment in New York City, which we constantly talk about renovating. But we're so expensive that I don't know how to do it.
Hire somebody else. Hire somebody cheaper.
That's a good idea. No, I'm definitely a modernist. If I had to put it into a sort of historical perspective, I would relate our work to Cubism in that sense, in that it's representational to a point, and then it's abstracted to the next point, and it's the sort of the memory and the dialogue that those two sort of ethics engender that makes the action. So I'm definitely we are definitely still modern architects.
Let me bring you back to Times Square with this next question, which actually is one that I was about to ask earlier myself. How does the Times Square project address the nighttime signage requirement, and are entertainment spaces a central part of the design? The zoning laws, the very special zoning laws for Times Square, do require particular exterior signs to keep some of the flavor of Times Square, and also theater-related or entertainment-related uses.
There's a very complex new zoning ordinance that we are responding to, which is not only making retail space on Broadway, but a whole series of signage problems from very large scale to very immediate scale that we have to incorporate into and on our building. There's some discussion, I might add, in the preservation, from the preservationist point of view, that the whole thing that drove this signage issue, which is, to my mind, somewhat out of scale, was to retain the image of Times Square in spite or despite of these new buildings. It was, I think, in reaction to what happened on 6th Avenue with the sort of relentless scaled buildings that did not really establish a place or a sense of the pedestrian scale. But it was also, in a romantic sense, not to lose the, quote, image of Times Square. I think, like anything else, you can't legalize collage.
Right.
You can't
institutionalize.
You can't institutionalize collage, and you can't institutionalize history, visual history. Is that things come about because of other pressures, because of other conditions, and there is, to my mind, a sort of gap between reality and stage set that has to do with this ordinance, which we're struggling with.
Right.
So from our point of view, the idea of mega sign, large-scale sign, is a very interesting one, because that may also be a new art form, maybe a new way of bringing a different kind of sort of perception of sign to the public, being that scale with all the new sort of computer images that one can get and everything else. Is that we're trying to look at it from that point of view, because our clients think that it'll be impossible to rent the amount of signage that is required, given what it costs today. So they're sort of giving it back to the city as a kind of new art form. And from that point of view, I think it's very exciting. It's been very frustrating, however, to deal with the issues of views out, being covered by signage, and trying to reconstitute in a way romantically that whole Times Square ethic. So I think maybe the intentions, again, are right. It's how it's been written and the sort of lack of flexibility that is, in a sense, written into it as the first phase. I think it has to go through a whole phase to be adjusted and amended, and it may be all right. I think it's out of scale right now.
You have not yet achieved a final solution in your own building, though, to how you'll
No,
respond.
but we're actually much closer. Pittsburgh Glass, not to plug them necessarily, but they've come up with a whole series of glasses where they can put dots on a glass that on certain light reads as opaque, and you can see through it from inside, and the whole potential of graphic overlay and the compositeness of actually projecting on that kind of glass is very interesting. So we're getting a whole different sort of ambiguity of facade in that signage band, which has potential to it that we didn't know 3 months ago.
So there really is enormous potential for a whole new, really a new technology of signage here.
Well, but it's like I say, if you take the constraints, which I consider those constraints a part of the problem, and then you try to discover the essence of the problem and to invent and to extend the problem, then you may not be victim to the sort of sterilization that these kind of laws sort of provoke. So that's part of the game. It's just very hard to design your first skyscraper and become a signage expert all at the same time. It's, you know.
Things are tough. What can we say?
Things are tough.
I mean, I agree with you that these laws, in one sense, are an attempt to create by fiat something that arose spontaneously and much more naturally in another generation. All those the crazy quilt patchwork of commercial signs. On the other hand, faced with a choice between a somewhat artificial construct of signs that lacks the spontaneity of the original Times Square versus the sterility of Sixth Avenue, I think most people would still prefer to see some kind of artificial construct on Times Square rather than a reproduction of Sixth Avenue.
From that point of view, that's true. However, you have to admit that Times Square is not about buildings.
Right.
It's about a space and the animation
right.
of that space. So, but at one time, it was about buildings. There were very great facades in Times Square that had a real presence, like the Paramount Theater, the Roxy
right.
Theater. Those sort of edifices of sort of frontality
right.
that sort of established the sense of place were all torn down.
Right.
And very sadly torn down,
right.
I think. I mean, that's the kind of thing. See, it's too late. I mean, that's always the problem. If we were talking about this issue and those buildings still existed, we
right.
would be talking about a different issue. And I
right.
think that's the sort of tragedy.
No, it's true. We are. I mean, the Times Square that everyone is trying to save was lost before the effort to save it began. It's really what.
Its morality was lost, and also its building presence
right.
was lost.
Right. Good. I'm going to break briefly for a public service announcement from somebody who says, if anyone in the audience wants a ticket for Michael Graves next week, I have an extra. Raise your hand now, and I'll look for you after the program. So if there's anybody seeking an extra ticket, raise your hand. There may be one floating around if you can connect up afterwards. Let me give you just a couple of final ones. As an architect, do you perceive a fiduciary duty to society at large, or in particular the homeless and others for whom architecture is a fundamental need? Do you engage in any pro bono activities at your firm?
I think architecture in general is pro bono. We have done a significant amount of public housing that was both HUD and HEW funded. We've done it through the private sector as well as through local housing authorities, and we've been very gratified on the one hand that we think we are contributing to a better well-being in the physical environment for people who heretofore maybe had no housing or had substandard housing. So from that point of view, it's very gratifying. From the architectural point of view, aside from the basic strategies of making private space, making identity,
right.
Understanding the sort of sociological priorities, which I think we do very well. The difficulty then is to animate that architecturally because of the tough budgets and again the sort of standards. I think if government agencies understood the real implications of construction costs and wrote that in as fervently as they write the program, is that we would get a lot more relevant public housing on every level, both the urban level and the personal level of the people involved. So we always have tried to stay involved in that very essential kind of work. And I wish, in a sense, as I look back on it, that the buildings were prettier. I mean, it's as almost basic as that. I think they solve a lot of the problems, but they don't elaborate in the way that we're talking about tonight.
Right.
And I wish they did.
Would they now, if those jobs came your way right now?
I think, again, knowing the problem and understanding the limits is that we could do it better today,
Right.
if we did it again.
I mean, I do sense in your work there's a very real evolution in your sense of what constitutes a kind of morally acceptable object, in a way. I mean, it's become a much more sensuous object in your work as it's evolved over the years.
Well, I think the one thing that this whole sort of screaming historicism and preservationism and we call it postmodernism, some people do, provoked in anyone who teaches and in anyone who knows about history and cares about it is that it provoked, at least for us, a way of freeing ourselves of the sort of the restriction of the modernist dogma.
Right.
Dogma is a dead end, if you think about it. It doesn't allow intrusion, and it doesn't go beyond the primary conceptual base. So that the whole thrust of reevaluating history, of saying that buildings should be saved, that there are inherent pertinent characteristics that are real and forever, sort of allowed us to enrich our own language, that we weren't tied down and intolerant, in a sense, by our own sort of inability to look beyond or to grow faster.
Right.
This whole thing's been very positive, and I think in that elaboration and in the enrichment of the modern language, which I think is far from static and far from sterile, is that there's a whole evolution going on, at least in our work, where it's more elaborate, it's more enriched, but it's also more refined at the same time. And I think the two together, hopefully in the next few years, are gonna come true.
You feel that process is continuing and is as alive as ever?
Absolutely.
Great. Good. Thank you very much, Charles
Thank
Gwathmey,
you.
and thank all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.